right, with the 1970s and Nixon's presidency, and we're starting to move towards Vietnamization that we've talked about in class, we're going to see a shifting in our foreign policy again. If we think about foreign policy from the beginning of the last unit to now, we were kind of imperialistic into isolationism, into neutrality, lend-lease, cash and carry, into full-on involvement into European affairs during World War II, into the Truman Doctrine, containment, and now we're going into containment, brinkmanship, again, limited conflict, and now we're into détente. And détente means release from tension. So Nixon is going to argue in 1971 for a balance of power, saying, quote, it will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong, healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China, Japan, each balancing the other. So détente was the key to this balance. And our Secretary of State is going to be Henry Kissinger. He is going to travel to China and the Soviet Union for secret sessions to plan summit meetings with the communists, basically meaning that, we're going to try to have more formal open lines of communications. Nixon believed the USSR and China were clashing over their interpretations of Marxism, and it could give the US an opportunity to kind of play off of each other. Nixon's also hoping by gaining their aid to pressure North Vietnam into a peace. So that's kind of what we're working for. So the China visit in 1972. This is the example of the China visit in 1972. It's called ping pong diplomacy. And the reason it's called ping pong diplomacy is because the U.S. national team in 1972, ping pong team, was invited to play against the Chinese national ping pong team. So the scene in Forrest Gump of them playing ping pong is the perfect example. And this is what's going to kind of open the door for China and the U.S. to start talking. And they're going to meet in 1972 with Mao Zedong. So part of this is the United States is going to have to recognize China and agree to support their admission into the United Nations and pursue economic and cultural exchanges. Now, if we think about this in modern terms, we're very happy they did that, or none of us would be having our iPhones right about now. Which is going to reverse the U.S. policy because we have not recognized China since 1949 when they fell to communism. China is officially going to be recognized in 1979 by the United States. Now, the Soviet Union and détente is going to look a little different because in 1968, Czechoslovakia is invaded by the Soviets to squash a student reform movement. And Czechoslovakia is going to end up having one of the strictest governments in all of East Europe for the next 2 decades. And the U.S. is so preoccupied with Vietnam, there's little we can do to actually help the Czech reformers. Nixon's going to visit Moscow in May of 1972. He's going to play his China card with the Kremlin. Soviets want U.S. food supplies and fear an intense rivalry with a U.S.-backed China. There's talk of nuclear reduction, and we are going to actually fly to Russia to sign a historic arms treaty. So détente is really the highlight of Nixon's foreign policy foreign policy under his presidency. And one of the first big treaties is going to be SALT I, known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, that is signed in May of 72. So the U.S. and the USSR are going to agree to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles and to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles to 200 for each power. Both the U.S. and the Soviets had nearly 20,000 warheads by the 1990s. So we're we sign the treaty, but we don't necessarily stick to it, because what we end up developing is called MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, which is basically one missile that can carry a bunch of warheads. So while we reduce the number of missiles, we create missiles that have multiple warheads. So we kind of skirt around our own treaty. We're going to do a grain deal of 1972, which is a 3-year arrangement by which the U.S. agrees to sell at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals to the Soviet Union so they do not starve to death. If we look at how détente worked, it worked pretty well. It's considered successful, and it's going to also help in the Vietnam War. It does not end the arms race, though. So we move on to the Yom Kippur War, or what's also known as the Energy Crisis of 1973, sometimes called the Oil Crisis. And this is going to be basically a 6-day war over the Arabs and Western nations and their support over Israel. And so the Arab oil embargo is going to happen. The 6-day war was in 1967. So the Yom Kippur War is a different one in 1973. My bad. So the 6-day war is when Israel invaded the Suez Canal with support from France and Britain, because the Egyptians had just nationalized the Suez Canal, even though the British had built it about 100 years earlier. And there was fighting over who should actually control the Suez Canal. So Britain and France convinced Israel to go ahead and invade, try to take over the Suez Canal, and it failed miserably. And so we also have the creation of OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This includes Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran. And it's going to raise the price of oil from about $3 to $11 a barrel in an attempt to force the United States to recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, which is run under Yasser Arafat. U.S. gas prices are going to double during this energy crisis. Lots of gas stations are going to run out of gas because Nixon refuses to create a ration for gasoline. And so it's going to become like a huge issue for America. And this is where we start to talk about getting rid of our foreign dependence on oil for the United States. All right, so let's switch over to New Federalism, which is going to be Nixon's domestic policy. And New Federalism is revenue sharing. So basically, Congress in 1972 passes a 5-year plan to distribute about $30 billion of federal revenue to the states. Welfare payments, instead of being federal, Nixon wants them to shift to the state, and a minimum income be established for poor families. But this program did not get pushed through Congress at the time. Civil Rights Act. So Nixon is going to try and block the renewal of the Voting Rights Act and delay implementation of court-ordered school desegregation in Mississippi. So think about that Southern strategy for a re-election. Supreme Court orders busing of students in 1971 to achieve school desegregation. So what that means is that if you have an all-white school with very few African American students, because most of the African American students live on the other side of town and go to a more African American school, have more of their population in that school, the United States is saying, okay, well, let's take that population of African American students and let's bus them across town to go to the more all-white school. So we have forced integration of the schools. So schools are zoned by neighborhoods, and that's basically saying, if you don't live in this neighborhood, it's okay. We're going to bus you to the school and make the schools more integrated. Nixon is going to propose an anti-busing bill, but Congress is going to block it. Nixon further establishes affirmative action by establishing goals and timetables for companies to hire women and minorities. Burger is going to get Warren E. Burger, don't confuse with the Warren Court. Burger is going to become the new conservative and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the first decisions he's going to decide is Roe v. Wade, which strikes down state anti-abortion legislation. All right, so this is the Burger Court. Warren Burger is the next Chief Justice. We've talked about Roe v. Wade. Now we need to talk about environmentalism. So there is a rise of environmentalism. During this time, we're going to see Earth Day established on April 22nd, 1970, and that is what we consider the start of our environmental movement. Now, the reason we have this environmental movement is contributed mainly to this book by Rachel Carson known as Silent Spring, which is going to expose the poisonous effects of pesticides. And that's what we get a push to establish the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. They're going to pass a Clean Air Act, a Clean Water Act, saying that basically the EPA is going to control pollution standards. We're also going to have toxic waste in the Love Canal, New York, where soil and groundwater got so polluted that the EPA declared the town unfit to live in. We also have the Cuyahoga River incident in Cleveland, Ohio, where you could actually set the river on fire, or the river became lit because there were so many chemicals in the water, the fire would burn, even though it was technically in water. And we, of course, have our protest over nuclear power with the 3 Mile Island incident. This is going to happen in March of '79 in Pennsylvania. This is the worst nuclear disaster in all of U.S. history. And the Corps released radioactive water and steam. Massive radiation was thought to going to be released as part of the accident. Thankfully, it never did. The reactor was shut down for 6 years, and over 100,000 residents were evacuated. So this is our worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history. We also see the Endangered Species Act of 1973. So we have federally protected land and water gets increased by 300,000. So this is synthesis to the conservation movement that we see under John Muir, Pinochet, and Teddy Roosevelt. But the criticism is that Wetlands Regulation and Endangered Species Act is going to impose unconstitutional restrictions on landowners, and we lose some tax income off of that as well. Wage and price control. So in '69, Nixon's going to cut spending and raise taxes. The Federal Reserve Board is supposed to raise interest rates, but the economy is going to grow a little worse. So that's not going to work out so well. Unemployment is going to be 6% in 1970s, and inflation is going to reach 12% by '71. So the cost of living is going to triple between 1969 and 1981. And it's the longest and steepest inflationary cycle in U.S. history. All right, so in 1970, Congress, for some reason, is going to give the president the power to regulate prices and wages. And Nixon is going to announce a 90-day price and wage freeze. So that means the price of milk cannot go up in those 90 days, but your salary cannot go up in those 90 days. They also cannot go down. In '73, the voluntary wage and price control goes on everything except healthcare, food, and construction. Inflation is still rising. Nixon's going to cut back on government expenditures, meaning he is not going to have the government spend as much money. So this is kind of what we call the economy becoming stagnant. And this is where we're going to get the term stagnation, which is going to plague more Ford and Carter's presidencies, which we're going to get to here in a minute.